manifestations and guises and all its emergent technologies serves to influence things like professional identity, professional decision-making, autonomy, division of labour, governance and power dynamics. So it's with this perspective today that I present my work to question what we know about professional sense-making in relation to these technologies that we refer to as evidence-based guidelines, and how this professional sense-making process positively or negatively influences the embedding or the normalisation of evidence-based guidelines. And with no slide.
We're good at it.
No, you need to have your screen up, sorry. Just do this.
Okay, let's try this again now. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so the argument that I wish to set up today is that we can all agree, I think, that the patient or service user should be the central concern of our evidence-based guidelines. However, I would say it's also imperative to consider the healthcare professional within this. Why? Because evidence-based guidelines as an aspirant knowledge translation technology have the potential to fundamentally alter the interaction between the patient and that healthcare professional. If you like, the healthcare professional is the critical conduit. They dictate to probably the largest part the success or failure of that guideline. And guideline failure is significant. The policy to practice gap is less of a gap and more of a chasm, with estimates that about 30 to 40% of patients do not receive treatment that's been based upon scientific evidence. Now, clearly this isn't the arena in which to problematise the gap, but I do just want to raise the point that if we're investing in such an expensive venture as guideline development and dissemination, why are we not consistently achieving its desired end? So if we are concerned about this policy to practice gap, it would seem sensible to consider the sense-making or interpretive activity that critical conduit, that healthcare professional, undertakes the moment they are faced with an evidence-based guideline. And Mike Kelly said yesterday, evidence cannot speak for itself, it has to be interpreted. And the same is so for the guidelines. So for me, this begs the question, what is it that might make an evidence-based guideline professionally meaningful? And if this question is even answerable, could the guideline development process take that into account? For those of you who don't like spoilers, close your ears now. Because the bottom line is that I am not going to provide you with any answers today. I'm really going to raise some more questions. So my discussion today is going to be framed conceptually through a science, technology and society, or STS, perspective. And for those who are unfamiliar with this sociological concept, it's essentially an approach that emphasises social agency and the structures within which those social agents are embedded. And specifically, it treats technologies or complex interventions, such as the implementation of evidence-based guidelines, as socially constructed. And that social construction is, as such, inherently contingent. There is no logical or predestined trajectory that any technology will follow, no matter how watertight it seems, or how innovative, or how evidence-based. So my plan for the next part of my session is to draw on two particular clinical guidelines to try and illustrate my point, to problematise some of the issues at hand and think about, how we may take this forward. So the first case in question is the NICE guidance on the management of lower back pain. And to explore the professional sense-making implicit in the professional reception of this guideline, I'm going to draw on two particularly insightful qualitative studies, neither of which are mine, I have to say. But both of these illustrate, I think, the potential problem with what I think is an arguably deterministic approach to guideline compliance and or guideline implementation and compliance. So this was this kind of linear model that was introduced by Pathman Tal in 1996, often referred to as the awareness to adherence model. But I think, you know, it is probably a gross over its simplification. So the first paper that I want to talk to you about is Bishop et al.'s team. They looked at, or they interviewed 53 clinicians from a multi-professional background. So this was GPs, chiropractors, acupuncturists, osteopaths, physios, nurses, the full Monty, from both public and private sectors. Their key findings were that the clinical guideline was, and I quote, merely one relatively peripheral influence in the healthcare professional's decision-making process. And the authors then suggested, via a process of thematic analysis, a number of issues which rendered the guideline peripheral or marginalised. So the first thing that they identified was the terminology and the definition of the problem at hand. So the most basic fundamental thing, what was the problem the guideline was addressing? In this case, it was persistent, non-specific lower back pain. And that simply, as a problem, was not commensurate with the way in which many of the practitioners thought about their professional theoretical frameworks. And by that I mean they supported a much more etiological modelling of lower back pain, because that was the way in which they then went on to develop and inform individualised treatment plans. Put quite simply, the professionals weren't talking the same language as the guideline, and they certainly weren't sharing a common philosophy. Secondly, healthcare professionals questioned the nature of the evidence, and this is a well-rehearsed argument, and it's been a well-rehearsed argument over the course of this conference. So the relevance of population-based trials for their patients. And whilst most of the healthcare professionals were receptive to the notion of evidence-informed individualised care, the evidence that they valued most highly was experiential, whether that was their own, their colleagues, or their patients. And interestingly, particularly bearing in mind that what Bill's just reminded us of in that little sort of caveat in all guidelines about accommodating values and hinting at some flexibility, healthcare practitioners who tailored their approach in response to the guideline then deemed themselves non-adherent. Finally, from this paper, healthcare professionals further marginalised the guideline because it didn't feel representative of the structural context within which they were working. Some of this was related to resource constraints, but a significant factor was the lack of knowledge regarding the roles of others. So GPs and nurses didn't really know what the other allied health professionals could offer. The perceived disparity between the notional real world and the guideline produced the titular quote here, that evidence-based guidelines are just lovely pie-in-the-sky plans. And we heard this yesterday. I think one of our colleagues from South Africa, I can't spot him now, said, we don't have the luxury of following evidence-based guidelines because we've got a 6-month waiting list for MRI scans. So, you know, this is a common factor. The second paper is Figan Latham and Rajendran's study from last year. And the osteopaths will all... So they looked at decision-making and rationalising amongst 12 self-declared rejectors of the NICE guidelines. And similarly, a significant finding was that guidance just simply didn't resonate with the practitioner's philosophy of practice. And some conceptualised it as an unacceptable challenge to their professional autonomy and what Richard Sennett would refer to as professional craft work. And in the words of the authors, and I think this is really important, participants appeared affronted by the nature of the evidence. That's a really strong word. The evidence was deemed or viewed sceptically by some as well, quickly past its sell-by date, or more significantly biased by conflicts of interest. But the authors conclude that the central theme driving the rejection of the guideline was professional self-identity. Okay? So if we momentarily return to that very linear awareness to adherence model, we can appreciate how it is an oversimplification of the complexity of all the professional sense-making processes that take place. And rather than being linear, I think it looks something much more like this. So, we start to create this picture which exposes the critical influence of professional self-identity in the way in which healthcare professionals might interpret and make sense either of specific guidelines in a singular notion or guidance in general. And what these two papers offered us was some really interesting findings and insights, but they're not unique. This is not a new story. We've known this for quite a while. And there are any number of papers, including Carlson's really good metasynthesis of GPs' attitudes to clinical practice guidelines, which, highlight the centrality of these aspects of professional self-identity. So just very quickly, another guideline to think about is a clinical guideline 83. And this was interesting to me because my clinical background was within critical care. And over my career, I'd seen this paradigm shift in how we conceptualise critical care, and in particular, how we think about rehabilitation in critical care. And we've seen this emergent idea that early mobilisation is really important. We don't want to sedate and paralyse and immobilise our patients anymore. And we're starting to move them much quicker, even if that's passively. So for patients who still require significant organ support as well. So NICE produced Clinical Guideline 83, which supports this comprehensive rehabilitation approach for virtually all adult patients admitted to intensive care. But Guideline 83 and all its international equivalents have been published for a good 8 years now, but early mobilisation is evident in only discrete pockets of practice. Current estimates suggest that less than 20% of all eligible adult patients receive the intervention as described in the guideline. So some time ago, I was asked to evaluate a unit that actually had successfully changed its practice. So they had adopted this guideline. The guideline was purportedly embedded or normalised in practice. So I thought, fantastic, this is a great opportunity for me to use this STS approach, try and understand what was it in that guideline that was professionally meaningful. So I use this thing called the normalisation process theory, and that there are any number of theoretical frameworks. Trish was talking about actor network theory yesterday. But I'm particularly interested in this mid-range theory developed by Carl May at Southampton. And for me, what MPT adds is that it really exposes human agency and the way in which they attempt to impose order and direction on contending, conflicting, contingent, and often turbulent patterns of social actions and relations. So if you like, it maps the trajectories of contingency when a new technology like a guideline is introduced. And it's constructed around these four domains of coherence, so how they make sense of it, the cognitive participation, so how they create a community of practice, how the work actually gets done at the end of the day, and how they appraise the significance. And the reason I liked it was because, for me, it mapped very closely to those ideas of professional self-identity. Okay, so we went in and we interviewed multi-professional staff, and we used the four constructs of normalisation process theory to design the study and to analyse our data. Now, clearly, I've not had time to present this in full, but I just want to give you a flavour of what we discovered. This is a quote from one of the doctors which really blew me away. I'll let you read that, and whilst you read, I'll talk. So for the doctors interviewed, the evidence base within the clinical guideline was coherent with their professional self-identity because, bizarrely for me, it was perhaps because it was quite a young consultancy group, they saw themselves as advocates of the exercise as medicine movement, and therefore they valued the evidence as meaningful. And interestingly, they ranked rehab evidence in a way that has not always been seen across certainly not the critical care profession. But in this case, it was seen as at least comparable to more traditional critical care science. For the therapy staff, so for the physios and the OTs, the evidence was discussed in a very different fashion. And for this group, the guideline had a completely different performativity. So physiotherapists appeared to be using it, and the occupational therapists, as a professionalisation strategy. So historically, physios had described the relative paucity of evidence for the respiratory care that had been their bread and butter working practice on critical care. And they felt that the lack of evidence for those practices had made them professionally very vulnerable. The OTs were in a completely different place. They said they'd even struggled to get the foot through the door. But all of a sudden, the new emphasis via this clinical guideline on the importance of rehabilitation offered them this unique position from which to redefine and bargain their status within the unit and champion physio and OT. The majority of the nurses who were interviewed were not familiar with the evidence that underpinned the guideline, and some described as being very sceptical at the outset, this isn't going to work for my patients. But for this group of staff, what was valued most was the experiential evidence. They only made sense of the clinical guideline after a period of time. So for them, it was that reflexive monitoring and appraisal work that was most essential. And they created these shared stories or testimonials, which was significant in creating a critical mass of nurses who had signed up. For those who actually delivered the rehab, the guideline had initially been adapted in order to allow them to test it out in practice. And the therapy staff and nurses described literally making sense of the guideline by starting with what's termed the level 2 patients, so the relatively less dependent critically ill. So they demonstrated its coherence to their existing professional work and then developed the confidence to roll it out wholesale. And this staged or stratified response was deemed critical to the success of implementation. So what can we take from this kind of brief expose of 2 clinical guidelines? I've just got a couple of things to offer. I think that a sociology of professions perspective potentially has much to offer evidence-based policy. And from the work that I've presented here, which represents one minuscule part of the jigsaw puzzle, we can see that the sense-making processes differ across professions, across contexts, and probably across times. A key factor that I think we need to think about is the performativity of a guideline, and it's the sociology of the profession's perspective allows us to see that guidelines, or the performativity of guidelines, extend far beyond the clinical practice and clinical encounter, and may offer a route to professionalisation or reprofessionalisation. And people like Mark Berg have talked about this, in different contexts. And interestingly, some preliminary data from some work I'm doing now suggests that healthcare professionals who are facing the challenges of the sustainability and transformation plans are actually using evidence-based guidelines to help them preserve their occupational jurisdiction. I also believe that this STS perspective is really critical, and that normalisation process theory is a really valuable way to help us expose the professional, especially if we want to understand how they come to embody and enact evidence-based guidelines as their new normal or not. It shines a light on human agency, and especially that interpretive process. So is this problem even meaningful? I'm going to, because she can't be here, I'm going to add that in. Trish said this perfectly, responding to Mike Kelly's tweet there. She's saying the clinical questions are often different to the research questions. We need to be talking the same language. So this normalisation process theory helps us expose that. It helps us ensure that we're articulating and constructing guidelines in a way that resonates with professional philosophy and, the types of evidence that they find meaningful. It also has the potential to offer insight into an issue which seems to recur in the empirical data, that of interprofessional understanding and dynamics. And my personal thoughts here are that evidence-based policy and guidelines need to pay much more attention to aspects of interprofessional education and interprofessional working. And I just want to float an idea here that whilst normalisation process theory has been used as a framework to retrospectively study implementation of guidelines, the developers also suggest that it can be used as a prospective tool. So is there then potential to use this as a heuristic guide to the development process? Or do we accept that just as every patient is unique, which causes problems for guidelines, equally, so is every healthcare professional, and is this just another series of layers to add to that whole wicked problem? And I'm going to simply thank you for listening, and I'm going to look forward to hearing your thoughts after Matt has continued this story. Thank you.